this evening to Exodus 2. And there were several scriptures that we didn't cover this morning, and I thought that really there's not quite enough here for a whole message, but we're going to try to make a message out of it in these few verses here, or this portion, Exodus 2. And we're going to pick up in verse number 16 in just a moment. But it's been said that Moses was in Egypt for 40 years, and it took another 40 years for God to get Egypt out of Moses. He was 40 years in Egypt, then he went to Midian for another 40 years. And it was while Moses was in Midian that God was preparing him for the work that he had called him to do. Just a reminder, this morning's message, Moses tried to do the work God called him to do, but he tried to do it in his own strength. And the results were disastrous. People got hurt. There was misunderstandings. He was full of fear, ran from his consequences, and there was a delay in God's work getting done by 40 years. It seems that way. That's the way we preached it anyway. So tonight we're going to look at the rest of this chapter and see some of the things that God did to prepare Moses for the work that he called him to do. And there's a work that God has to do in every single one of us before God can use us. We're not born ready. We're not born prepared. There's a lot of things God has to get out of our life really before he can use us to full capacity. There's a lot of things he has to put in us that we don't have already. There's things we need that we don't even know we need. And Moses was no different. And so what we're going to see is God had a lot of work to do in Moses. And I'm going to put it this way, and God only had 40 years to do it in. And so Moses needed to be a really fast learner because he's a man, remember? He's a man. And sometimes our heads are as hard as stone and they're thick, and we're not quick learners when it comes to things that, especially when we think we're doing it the right way. It's hard for us to make a U-turn, right? It's hard to make a U-turn and learn it another way. Exodus 2, let's pick up in verse number 16, and we're going to see some of the things that God had to do in preparing Moses. But let's read through this, and let's see what's going on, and we'll make a few comments, and then we'll go back through it. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock, and the shepherds came. Now this is interesting, these mean old shepherds, and drove them away. So here these 7 gals are. They're at the well. They're drawing water from the well, and they're just putting it in the troughs so that they can water their flocks. And then here comes the men, the shepherds, and they see them girls there, and what do? Just like a typical guys, y'all get out of here. Go on, us first. Our sheep are thirstier than yours. Get out of here. Go on, you can get this later. Whatever it was. But it seemed that's how it was when we read a little bit farther. That's just how it was every day. Them shepherds would come and they'd run them girls off. They were dumb guys, weren't they? And they'd run them girls off, and it's just how it was. Notice I looked up here, right? The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up, and I appreciate that. Moses stood up and helped them. And Moses had that reputation for standing up for other people. he did that when he saw the Egyptian smiting a Hebrew. He stood up for him. And the next day when he saw two Hebrews of his brethren, they were arguing, he stood up for one. He stood up for the one that was being wronged. So he often stood up for people. And here he is, he's standing up for these girls, these ladies. That's not right, what you men are doing. But Moses stood up and helped them. But not only did he help them, but look what else it says. It says, and watered their flock. So that was awful nice. So Moses comes, he drives those shepherds away. You know, you kind of wonder what he said, right? They were here first, buddy. Wait your turn. Back of the line, boys. I don't know. But you wonder what he said. And so not only did he drive these shepherds off, but he helped water these ladies' sheep. Or whatever their flocks were. But verse 18 says, and when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, how is it that you're come so soon today? So his girls come home early. He's like, whoa, what are you girls doing home so early? And notice what they say in verse number 19. And they said, an Egyptian delivered us. Look at the words they're using, right? Delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. Well, what a deliverer, right? I mean, Moses was a deliverer, right? So he delivered them. It's interesting, though, that these girls refer to Moses as an Egyptian, because he was a Hebrew. So I just get the impression that, he did come from Pharaoh's house, so maybe it was his attire. I don't know. But he looked like an Egyptian. His appearance was. And so these ladies said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. So here Moses is cranking on that handle to get that bucket of water up out of the well, however they did it. And then he's, like I tell my wife, when she asks, what do you want me to do? I said, just sit there and look pretty. And maybe that's what he said to them girls. Y'all just sit there and look pretty. I got this covered. Right? Just sit there and look pretty. And I don't know what he says. I'm embellishing it, I know. But verse number 20 says, and he said unto his daughters, and where is he? What'd you do with the guy? Where is he at? Why is it that ye have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. Girls, didn't I teach you any better than that? Where's he at? What's wrong with you? Get him. Didn't you invite him for dinner? Verse 21. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. Well, I guess so. He had 7 daughters, right? And he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. And she bare him a son. And he called his name Gershom. For he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. And that's an interesting statement, because really all of Moses' life, he had been a stranger in a strange land. Not only Midian wasn't his home, but Egypt wasn't his home either. And so he names his son Gershom. And it means, I've been a stranger in a strange land. And that's a parallel to Christians. We've lived here all our life, but you know what? This world is not our home. We're not at home. It's not our home. And verse 23 says, and it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried. And their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. So let's backtrack a little bit here and see some of the things that God is already doing in preparing Moses to deliver his people. And the first thing, I believe it's obvious, is God had to get Moses out of Egypt. God could never, and I think that's an accurate way of saying that, he could never work in Moses' heart what he wanted to do completely as long as Moses was in the middle of Egypt. Egypt has always served as a type of the world. Sinful place. If you desire to do much for God, you're going to have to separate yourself from the world. Moses had to separate himself from Egypt and from the sin that Egypt offered to him. We'll see that in a minute. As a reminder, Moses had every pleasure freely available to him that Egypt offered. It was all available to him. And a life that is full of sinful pleasures is not going to be a fruitful life for the Lord. It's just not going to be. And as long as Moses was in Egypt, enjoying the pleasures of sin, he was never going to be the person that God wanted him to be. He needed to separate from the sin and the pleasures that Egypt had to offer. And you know, there's a parallel to you and me today. Really, if we want to be used of God in our full capacity, we have to separate ourselves from sin. And you know, this is a voluntary thing. It's not something that we say, God, would you take this away from me? Have you ever prayed something like that? God, I don't want to be tempted by that anymore. Just take it away. It doesn't work that way. It's sometimes there's things that take, you have to voluntarily say, I'm going to, and stay away from it, separate it. When it comes to speech, we need to separate ourselves from the world's speech. There's a separation. The world's dress. Here, when these ladies first found Moses, he looked like all the Egyptians. They could not tell a difference. They did not know that he was one of God's people. He looked just like the rest of the world. But 40 years later, he didn't look like an Egyptian. And there was a time when after Moses got done spending time with God and he went before the people, remember what the Bible says his face did? His face shone. And I'm going to put it this way, there was so much God on Moses, what did the people do? They put a veil over Moses' face. He didn't look like an Egyptian anymore. God was on him. So Moses had to separate himself from the world. Speech, dress, the music. I'm trying to make this practical to us today. Our speech doesn't need to sound like the world. Our dress does not need to look like the world. The music we listen to should not be the world's music. Our attitude should not be the same as the world's attitude. We should be separate. We should be different. And if we want to be used of God, we really do have to be separate from the world. We have to be. Let me show you what Hebrews, if you will, hold your place here and go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11. Notice what verse number 24 says about Moses and a decision that he made. He made a voluntary decision. Because we read that this morning. Remember, it came into Moses' heart to what did it say? To see his brethren. But look what it says in Hebrews 11 and verse number 24. We're talking about voluntarily separating ourselves from the things of the world, the sinful things, in order for God to use us to full capacity. By faith, Moses, this is an act of faith. When he was come to years, 40 years old, the Bible says he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Choosing rather, this was a choice he made, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. And it says, by faith he forsook Egypt. And on it goes. Moses had to voluntarily separate himself from what Egypt had to offer. And it was sinful pleasures. That's what Hebrews 11 says. And he chose to suffer affliction rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin. He didn't say, God, if you want to use me, if you're going to use me, God, just take all this sin away from me. Moses had to get away from the sin. He had to get it out of his. He had to separate himself from it. There's a lesson to be learned there. God didn't just take it away. Moses had to give it up. The next chapter in Hebrews, look what verse number 1 says. Hebrews 12 and verse number 1. It kind of further solidifies this point. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Look what it says about sin in the believer's life. Let us lay aside, that's a voluntary act. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that's set before us. And we know the next verses after that. So even in the believer's life, we see it in Moses' life, it's true in your life and in my life. In order for God to use us, really use us, there's a separation from the world and the sinful pleasures that it offers that we have to voluntarily make. God won't just take it away. We have to lay it aside, like Hebrews 12 says. So the first thing I can see that in Exodus 2 that God was doing in preparing Moses is he had to get him out of Egypt. He had to get him out of the world. And the same is true for you and me. All right, next, look back in Exodus chapter 2. And let's look in verse number 16. Not only did God have to get Moses out of Egypt, but we're going to move real quick here. It says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. The very first part of that verse, now the priest of Midian, 40 years, here Moses is spending time with his father-in-law, Jethro. Here his name is Reuel, but you'll see later on in the scripture that and Jethro are the same person. But Moses not only needed to get out of Egypt, but he also needed a preacher. Just the way we're going to put it. He needed a preacher. He needed someone to teach him. And here he has Jethro, priest of Midian. Now, Jethro was not a Levite, he was a Midianite. And the Midianites were descendants of Abraham, but not from Abraham and Sarah. Remember, Sarah passed away and he married Keturah. And Midian was one of their sons. Now, I don't know how doctrinally straight they were, but he was a priest. And we can see also later in Exodus chapter 18, we can see Jethro working as a priest here, a Midianite priest. Exodus 18, I'll just show you this quickly. Exodus 18. And we're just trying to show you that the things that God needed to put in Moses' life to prepare him for the work that he needed to do. And one was he needed to get him out of Egypt. Two, he needed to give him a preacher. In Exodus 18, it says, when Jethro the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her 2 sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land, and the name of the other Eleazar. For the God of my father, said he, was mine help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the mount of God. And he said unto Moses, I'm thy father-in-law Jethro, am come unto thee, and thy wife and her 2 sons with her. And I just want to move down a little bit farther here. Jethro's rejoicing, and it says in verse, if you move down to verse number 12, Jethro's hearing all about how God delivered Moses and the children of Israel, and he's just excited about this. Well, verse 11 says, this is Jethro speaking. He says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. And notice what verse number 12 says. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So here he is working in the capacity of a priest, though he was not a Levite. That's interesting. He's still working as a priest to God. And of all the people God leads Moses to, he leads him to a priest. And I think for a reason, to teach Moses and just teach him about God. Remember, he had been trained in all the wisdom of Egypt. He needed to learn something about God. So God sends him to a priest. And not only was Jethro a priest, but he's also a good teacher, a practical teacher. Later on in that chapter, you'll see that when Moses went out to judge the people, Jethro said, Moses, what are you doing? All day long, Moses was judging one matter and another matter, and Jethro gave Moses some very practical advice. You need to get to delegate this. We'll just kind of condense it to that. So Moses needed a preacher and he needed a teacher. And Jethro served in that capacity to Moses. Third thing, Exodus chapter 2, this is the last one. And it's also, it's down in verse number 21, really. But here's the third thing Moses needed for God to prepare him for the work that he would do. And if you'll read verse 21, just look at verse number 21 and tell me what God gave Moses. He gave him a wife. I think a wife was necessary for Moses to serve. Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. So now he's not a single man anymore. He's a married man. And remember, just a reminder, I don't want to butcher it, but Proverbs 18, 22 talks about whoso findeth a wife. I'll wait till you turn there. We're talking about, this is something God had to give Moses to prepare him for the work that he had for him to do. Proverbs 18:22 says, whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing. And look what it says. And we've said this verse several times, and obtaineth favor of the Lord. Married men, you have found favor with God. Single guys, it's coming, right? But when you find a wife, you have found a good thing. Found a good thing. And that's a way of God showing his favor to you, expressing his favor to you. And Moses needed a wife to accomplish the work, to do the work that he called him to do. Can you imagine? And I like trying to put yourself in the situation. Can you imagine the late night conversations that Moses had with his wife? I mean, with leading the people of Israel out of Egypt and their time in the wilderness. And could you imagine? I mean, honey, I'm about to kill him now, Moses. Calm down. You know what my sister's doing? You know what my brother's doing? They had to talk about these things, right? It had to come up. So Moses needed a companion, a helpmeet, to help him accomplish what God called him to do. We know that a wife puts us in balance, men. Wives, you know your husband puts you in balance. You know that when you talk with her or you talk with your husband, you listen to what they have to say because you get something from a different perspective then. You know, women don't think like men and men don't think like women. But when we come together and talk about things, does it not balance out our thinking? Surely Zipporah helped Moses in that capacity. Surely it did. We probably could add another point in verse 22, but there's something else that God gave Moses. And this may very well be in preparation for the work that God called him to do. You see what it is in verse 22? God gave him a kid, gave him a son. He made him a parent. Well, that's very practical. Because with parenting comes patience. And Moses sure needed that. You know, I'm sure Gershom wasn't perfect. So in preparing Moses, you know, God had to get him out of Egypt. He had to get Moses, let me put it this way. Moses, that was a step Moses had to do. He had to separate himself from the world. And then after he did that, we see God gave him a preacher, a priest. And we see that God showed him favor. He gave him a wife. And God gave him a child. And to me, all these things are done for the reason of preparing Moses to lead God's people out of Egypt. I think so. All right. That is the message tonight. And I think if we look at our life and that now, let me say this. I need to backtrack for sure. About Moses getting a wife. That doesn't mean that just because you're not married, God can't use you. That's not what I'm saying at all. There was a lot of men and women in the Bible that remained unmarried their whole life that God used mightily. But in Moses' case, it seems that he needed a wife. It seems that way. Paul the Apostle wasn't married.